Hello and welcome to Brain in a Vat. Today we have Kate Manne with us, and Travis Timmerman will be joining us as a co-host, which we're excited about. And Kate will be talking about her book Unshrinking. And Kate, would you like to start with a real-life case?
Um, so this is a case of a patient, Jen Curran, who was a 38-year-old woman who had skyrocketing blood pressure and was counseled by her doctor to just lose some weight. And the blood pressure, the other issues with protein in her urine, these increasingly alarming physiological symptoms, they hadn't resolved after Jen had had a baby, given birth. And Jen felt like she had already been down the weight loss path. So she'd lost 115 pounds earlier in her life by being very strict with diet and exercise. And she just wasn't convinced that the physician she was seeing was really giving her the correct advice. So she went and got a second opinion. Turns out she had bone marrow cancer, which was ravaging her body. No amount of weight loss or diet or exercise would have helped with what she was facing. And fortunately, she, unlike many patients, was able to get on a regime of chemo that would help her in time to save her life. Her prognosis is reasonably good, or was at the time of writing. So this is a case that I think really dramatically highlights what many fat patients face at the doctor's office of being dismissed on the basis of their body size and told, just go home and lose weight, when they might have a much more serious problem, in this case, bone marrow cancer.
Yeah, so that seems like a paradigmatic instance of fat phobia. I'm wondering if we can just start at the beginning. You can say a little bit about how you're conceptualizing fat phobia, and you draw an analogy in the book between that as sort of a straitjacket types. I wonder if you can tell the listeners a little bit about that.
So, as a definitional matter, I see fat phobia as the unjust downranking of people in fatter or larger bodies. And that pertains to our moral status, our intellectual status, our sexual cum social status, and also our health status. So we can get into later, if you'd like, the complicated relationship between weight and health. I'm not maintaining there's no relationship there, but it's a complicated relationship, and it is fat phobic to say something like, as a doctor, just go home and lose weight, when a person's real symptoms are going uninvestigated and, in this case, undiagnosed. And in terms of the metaphor of the straitjacket of fat phobia I offer, that is a way to try to cash out the substantive effects of fat phobia in the world, where I think that in many domains of life, from education to employment to healthcare, as we've just highlighted, transportation, private and public spaces, people who are in fatter bodies are constrained in certain ways. They are really harmed, limited, and bruised by what I call the straitjacket of fat phobia, where I like this metaphor because it highlights that people in smaller bodies can have body image issues and certainly are often threatened by fat phobia not to gain any weight or told to be even smaller. But the larger your body gets, the more your circulation is likely to be cut off by the straitjacket of fat phobia, which also marks you as unworthy of care in a certain way, and maybe also as incompetent for having let your body get that way. So that's why the metaphor struck me as an apt one.
Can you speak a bit more about how society is structured in such a way that it has the straitjacket effect, that it constrains fat-bodied people in a way that's unhealthy or damaging for them?
Yeah, so I think what is useful in this arena is to look at the different domains in which fat phobia has a marked effect. So if you look at the whole life cycle, that's a way to bring this out. Fat children are amongst the most likely to be bullied in school, for example. Weight, as well as in some sectors, sexuality, are the most common bases for childhood bullying. And fat phobia also extends, unfortunately, and surprisingly to some people, to a children's teachers. So teachers are more likely to hold that a student is less competent, less brilliant, less able academically as they have bigger bodies. And you even see this in very suggestive studies. If a child gains weight and so increases in terms of their BMI, they are likely to be perceived as, for girls, less able readers, and for boys, less able mathematically, which corresponds, interestingly, to areas where a student is otherwise expected to do well according to gender stereotypes. So we see this in education. We also see this in employment, where there are huge differences, especially for women, between the pay awarded to someone who is very fat versus very thin based on the same job, the same qualifications, the same education level, the same job performance, and so on. There is, between a very fat and a very thin woman for millennials, about a $40,000 annual average wage gap amongst women in this demographic, which is just a huge difference. It's a low salaries worth of difference between women in those different categories. And we also see some effects for men, especially as they become very heavy, but those wage gaps tend to be less marked between fat and thin men. We also see that hiring is really affected. So there was one very important study that looked at a range of job candidates: thin man, thin woman, fat woman, for a range of employment opportunities: administrative assistant, lecturer, salesperson, manual laborer. And it turned out that the fat woman was judged the least suitable employee for every job opportunity. The thin man was judged the most suitable employee. So that gives you some insight into how, in so many domains of work, thin men are regarded as the gold standard and fat women as less promising candidates. So we could talk more about the effects of fat phobia in employment, but to just kind of move through these areas where the straitjacket of fat phobia is operative, we also, of course, have really big constraints on bodies when it comes to things like just moving through the world, transportation. A lot of people who are larger and who need to travel for work, for example, on an airplane, report having bruises literally left on their bodies because the seats are so small and just unsuitable for their particular body. So being unable to sit in an airplane seat, a bus seat, a train seat, unable to fit in a seat at a theater or in a grandstand. These really affects people's life prospects and opportunities and ability to flourish in their life in ways that I think are manifestly unfair. And then, of course, we come to, in a way, the most serious domain in which fat phobia is operative of all, which is healthcare. So the story that I highlighted in opening is meant to be, of course, just one anecdote, but representative of statistics, like the fact that fat people upon autopsy are 1.65 times more likely to have serious undiagnosed medical conditions like lung and heart infections, which could have cost them their lives and were undiagnosed in their lifetime, partly because there is so much prejudice against people in larger bodies at the doctor's office. And this isn't just implicit bias, this is explicit bias. This is physicians who will tick the box that says, I'm less likely to want to help a fat patient, that fat patients annoy them, that they intend to spend less time with fat patients, and that they regard fat patients as a waste of their time. So this is really going to affect how people are able to live their lives. It's going to affect their life prospects in multiple adjacent and overlapping regions, which make this qualify philosophically as a systemic problem that invades multiple domains that affect each other. Because, of course, if you get less education, then you're less likely to be able to apply for certain jobs. You're less likely to get good health insurance. You're less likely to be able to access good health care. And so this all comes together to make for really different life prospects for someone who is fat versus thin.
Yeah, I want to go back to healthcare, but there's two things in what you just said that I think may be worth discussing a bit more that are in the book. So one is that this prejudice seems pretty prevalent, and I think you suggest that it's one that's on the rise relative to others. And also that there's an intersectional element too, which was sort of touched on in the comments that you just gave.
So there's often this attitude amongst liberals or progressives, people of my political genre roughly, that bias is getting better. And it turns out that it is getting better in many domains. Of course, it's not a thing of the past, but we do find, based on a 2019 study by Harvard researchers, that implicit bias was getting better when it came to race, skin tone, sexuality, disability, age. And the only category of those they investigated, they didn't look at gender for reasons that have to do with the tests they were using. But the only form of bias that was getting worse in terms of implicit bias was anti-fatness or fat phobia. It was also the form of explicit bias that was decreasing the most slowly. So it looks like fat phobia is actually on the rise, at least according to this research that had a cutoff of 2016 in terms of data collection. And I think that despite that, or maybe because of that, maybe both, there is this sense of complacency amongst liberals and progressives about fat phobia, where it is actually a very serious issue and a deeply intersectional one. So it is something where I argue in the book, on the basis of various arguments, that we can't address really any form of systemic oppression that we allege to care about, like racism, like misogyny, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, ableism, without also addressing fat phobia, because the intersections of those categories are really non-trivial. And because fat phobia has, for example, a very active role in both historically and today oppressing Black folks, in particular in the American context. And we can get more into the sociologist Sabrina Strings' argument, if you'd like, as to why fat phobia is actually rooted in anti-Black prejudice and continues to perpetuate it today. But the upshot, at least, of those arguments is that we really cannot address any form of systemic oppression without also addressing fat phobia, partly because fat people are going to form a pretty significant chunk of most demographics just because we're a large population. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of the American population is arguably somewhat fat, at least according to the BMI classifications, which are problematic but are often useful as a reference point when it comes to scientific studies. So yeah, we're not going to be able to address, say, the gatekeeping in healthcare that trans people face without also addressing the root causes of that, which has to do with fat phobia as well as transphobic impacts on people who need, in my view, life-saving gender-affirming care. And of course, there is such a marked effect of fat phobia on women in particular that we're not going to be able to address misogyny or sexism, which are the topics that I've studied most over the last 10 years, without also addressing fat phobia, because fat phobia disproportionately impacts women and girls, and also arguably non-binary people as well.
I could be wrong about this. It's possible that there's some other root to the stigma, but I assume that at the core of the stigma behind all of these dimensions, or at least many of these dimensions, so the moral dimension, intellectual, social status, sexual status, is the idea that being fat is unhealthy for you. I assume that that sort of at the core of a lot of people's minds that underlies. There could be something else. There could be sort of disgust reactions or something like that that's different. But I assume that health underlies a lot of the stigma. So the debate, I assume, for a lot of people is going to be around that. It's going to be, so being fat is unhealthy for you. By being fat and it being unhealthy, it leads to all these other problems. And so people are going to justify their other attitudes on that. Do you think that's what's going on? And so that's the first question. The second question is, can you speak a bit more about what are the correlations, what are the relationships between health and weight?
I think it is a big piece of the puzzle. It isn't historically the way fat phobia came to be, and this will highlight the chicken and egg aspect to it, where it's often a question of, do we assume fat people are unhealthy because we're fat phobic, or are we fat phobic because we assume fat people are unhealthy? And I think it's really a both and answer. But historically, the belief that fat bodies were associated with being somehow primitive, I put in big scare quotes there, even again, big scare quotes, savage, that really came about through racism. So the origins of fat phobia predate the medical construction of a problematic fat body in interesting ways that I just want to briefly highlight before I get into the important question that you raised about the relationship between weight and health. So what Sabrina Strings, the sociologist from UCLA, argues in her book, the Fearing the Black Body, the Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, is that fatness was largely seen as a benign, even positive characteristic, especially for women, until the mid-18th century. So it's not to say there were dribs and drabs of fat phobia or elements of ambivalence towards the fat body historically, but it wasn't a systemic force until the mid-18th century, where what happened in Anglo-American culture was that British pseudoscientists and colonizers had to, by necessity, because of their own racist practices, where the transatlantic slave trade was burgeoning so quickly and dramatically, they had to try to come up with a reason why black bodies and white bodies were so different from each other, which is, of course, false. So what they invented, again from the armchair, was this idea of a fat black body. The idea that black people are much larger and were more suitable for certain kinds of labor, actually, because of the bulk of their bodies, and also that there were big differences between the bodies of black versus white women, where white women were much more dainty and black women were larger. And this wasn't based on observation. A lot of these men had never been to the relevant parts of Africa. But from the armchair, they made this speculative hypothesis that they then theorized and took hold socially, where it's important to be clear about the order here. It's not that fatness was seen as negative and then associated with blackness. It's that blackness was associated with fatness, and then fatness came to be derogated shortly thereafter. And it wasn't until the advent of health insurance nearly a century later, and arguably even 150 years later in the early 20th century, that the medicalization of fatness became a thing. And the invention of actuarial tables designed to see the relationship between someone's weight and height led to people making generalizations based on the kind of people who were buying health insurance, namely white men who were professionally employed. Then people began to make generalizations within the medical community about fat bodies being unhealthy. So it's actually really interesting that the racist origins of fat phobia predate the medical theories about fat bodies being unhealthy. But of course, that doesn't mean, thinking about things like the genetic fallacy, that it's incorrect that fat bodies are unhealthy. Maybe that's independently true. So let's delve into that. So it turns out that the relationship between weight and health can be captured in a crude, but I think quite initially probative way by thinking about a U-shaped curve, where, to many people's surprise, people who are in the quote-unquote overweight category of the BMI charts are going to have the lowest mortality risk, statistically speaking, on average. So that's right. People who are in quote-unquote overweight bodies have the greatest longevity, again, statistically speaking. And people who are in the even moderately obese category, so sort of this part of the curve, and people who are in the quote-unquote normal weight category have statistically indistinguishable mortality risks. So even being moderately obese doesn't increase mortality risks, and being overweight appears to be at least correlated with increased longevity. Now, it is true that people who are either underweight or more than moderately obese, so whose weight is very much statistically unusual in terms of the number of people who fit those categories, because now we're talking about people who are in a fairly low percentage of the population, maybe 2% are underweight, maybe 10% are more than moderately obese. Those people do have greater mortality risks. But we have to ask, as the idea of being underweight immediately brings out, is this causation or mere correlation? Is it that being, for example, very fat drives increased mortality? Or is it that this is mere correlation because there's a lot going on once people are in statistically more unusual weight categories? For example, someone who is very fat faces inadequate health care, faces lower screenings for certain cancers, faces the stress of weight stigma, which has demonstrable effects on health, and also faces things like weight cycling, where they're being put on diets, losing weight, then, as we can get into, almost inevitably regaining that weight, and that can have an impact on people's metabolic health, their immune dysfunction, cardiovascular health, and again, mental health can be affected. So what people have argued, and what I agree with in this space, is it's definitely possible that for some people, higher weight is driving increased mortality and morbidity. But as populations, it is still indeterminate whether higher weight causes health problems or whether this is mere correlation, and that the relationship between a very high weight and poorer health is driven by confounding variables, essentially, which mean that someone in these very high weight categories will have a lot going on, such that many of those other factors, like inadequate healthcare, might be leading to the fact that they do have poorer health outcomes and increased mortality.
I think that's very interesting, and I think that data, I've heard about this data before. It's sort of in line with, there's sort of an old wives' theory about being ill, which is that you need some weight on you to be able to survive really complex illness, like really severe illness, and that if you don't have that weight on you, you have a worse outcome. And I don't think many doctors phrase it that way, but it's sort of in line with that sort of folk understanding. But maybe the objector could push further, right? So they could say, okay, I agree with that data, but by looking at a very high order phenomenon like mortality rates, what that does is allows for lots of confounding variables. What we should rather do is look at very specific health outcomes and associate those with weight. So they might say, okay, let's not look at mortality rates, let's look at heart disease. Let's look at diabetes and say, what is the correlation there between weight and those health outcomes? And we know that someone with heart disease is more likely to die than someone without heart disease. And we know that someone with diabetes has worse health outcomes than someone without diabetes. And so that should guide us on these specific elements rather than a high order discussion of mortality.
So I agree with that, actually. That's why I spend a section of my chapter on weight and health, looking at the relationship between weight and particularly type 2 diabetes, because that's where there is a, genuinely strong, although of course imperfect, correlation between being fatter and being a type 2 diabetic. However, one thing we have to be really careful here, again, of is cause and effect. Because what researchers in this area don't know and are still arguing about is it that increased fat on the body increases rates or likelihoods of developing type 2 diabetes? Or is it that early diabetic processes that are driven by other factors, including genetics, including environment, including all sorts of things, early diabetic processes like insulin resistance are driving weight gain? And so that you end up with these correlations between type 2 diabetes and higher weights, partly because the condition itself drives weight gain. Now, it could be both and. It's not clear that we know exactly in what proportion, and the researchers that I've spoken to often suggest different guesses as to the varying importance of those two mechanisms. But again, I think it would be a mistake to infer that because there is this, again, strong but imperfect relationship between type 2 diabetes and higher weight, that the correct advice to people who are going into a doctor's office is lose weight and you'll have less chance of developing type 2 diabetes. That is actually very unclear, partly because what happens when people lose weight intentionally through diet and exercise, and likely through the new class of weight loss drugs when they come off them, as 80% of people do for various reasons, is weight regain is almost inevitable. That leads to what is known as weight cycling. So people tend to lose a bunch of weight, maybe 5, 10, 15% of their starting weight, then regain the weight almost inevitably. And that process of weight cycling actually has independent metabolic ill effects independently of starting weight. So one thing that is happening here is people make quick inferences from there's a relationship between type 2 diabetes and higher weight, which is correct. They don't necessarily pause to examine what is causing what. And regardless of the answer to that question, they infer that the correct advice to people is to lose weight, where 98% of people who do lose weight, at least through diet and exercise, will regain that weight, which most likely will have health ill effects that themselves could be harmful when it comes to conditions like type 2 diabetes. So the resulting picture has led people who often identify as weight neutral physicians to say the path of least harm may be to counsel patients to do things that are undoubtedly healthy, like exercising, like eating a healthful diet, but not intentionally losing weight. Some people on that regime may lose weight, some people will not. I know from experience that healthy practices don't necessarily push my body to lose weight. More extreme and unhealthy restriction is what I needed to do to lose weight. But in any case, physicians who are in this new paradigm will say that the way to do less harm here is often to counsel people to do healthy behaviors, but not to deliberately try to lose weight in order to avoid things like type 2 diabetes, partly because we don't know how to have people lose weight in a humane, sustainable, effective, long-term way, except perhaps by staying on the new class of weight loss drugs for the rest of their life, which is to many an unattractive but also risky proposition. And it looks like temporarily losing weight does more harm than good for most bodies.
So I wonder what a slightly more sophisticated critic would say, who says, I'm not criticizing fatness per se, but the bad health outcomes. And I recognize that that doesn't correlate perfectly with being fat or not only because you could be overweight on the BMI scale and still as healthy or even on average healthier than someone that's just below that, but also because you could be unhealthy at a range of weights, whether it's considered normal weight or whether it's statistically abnormally thin. I'm going to say, nevertheless, in focusing on that, that'll result in many people losing weight if they follow those outcomes. So the criticism is really about your cholesterol is high, so you have to reduce your cholesterol. One way you can do that is eat food that doesn't contain cholesterol in it. That doesn't necessarily result in weight loss. If you eat a purely plant-based diet, that won't have any cholesterol. But as a matter of fact, when people cut out their cholesterol or cut out foods that have cholesterol, they'll often lose weight. They have to reduce their blood pressure, and that might be giving up certain drinks or types of food that increase blood pressure. And that doesn't necessarily result in losing weight, but in most typical cases, it can. So they might grant all of this, but then suggest that there's still a strong enough correlation between being fat and having certain bad health outcomes that they can focus their suggestions on those in virtue of trying to get people to be healthier rather than trying to get them to not be fat?
I mean, meta-analyses, I think, cast doubt on that suggestion about the relationship between diet and weight loss. So what Tracy Mann and Janet Tamayama and her team looked at was these are medical researchers who set out to discover what's the best method for weight loss, like what's the best diet to induce weight loss, with a similar set of assumptions as the ones that you just mentioned, that like surely reducing cholesterol or surely going low fat or going low carb, like one of these will turn out to be the best method. And what they found was surprising to this team, which is that when they looked at every single longitudinal study of diets of all of these different kinds, so, something like 20,000 participants in total in the first study, more like hundreds of thousands in the second, which was done in 2014, in every one of those cases of diets that were studied over a 4 to 5 year period, they were not effective in reducing people's weight. So people would often lose weight over a year or 2 years, but the weight regain is really inexorable for the vast majority of bodies. So look, I think it's fine to think about certain kinds of health measures that we can take with respect to our own diets. I do worry a little bit, and we can get into this later, about whether prescriptive advice to restrict food can be triggering for some people who have a vulnerability to disordered eating or even eating disorders. So when it comes from a prescriptive place from a doctor, I think we have to be more careful there. But even those health measures like a low carb diet, a low fat diet, a low cholesterol diet, a vegan diet, all of these ways of approaching diet didn't lead to long-term weight loss. And what this team said, which was really interesting, was dieting does too much harm and too little good to be recommended as a safe, effective treatment for obesity, a word I put in quotes because it's not one of my words. I think it's stigmatizing. They said that they also found, based on their, again, meta-analyses of every single study, not just one or two, but every major diet study they could find that was sufficiently high quality and sufficiently longitudinal, that between 1/3 and 2/3 of participants in these studies regain more weight than they lose, again, over a 4 to 5 year period. So it's just surprising, but it appears to be true that diet, and even diet and exercise in combination, is just not the key to long-term weight loss. We don't really know what will make fat bodies thin in the long term. Bodies are really good at guarding against fat loss, it turns out.
Do we know for offhand those studies whether people regained the weight who had stayed in line with the optimal dietary cases that they were giving, or was it that they lost the weight and then they changed their diet or their activity in some way that resulted in them gaining it back?
So these are people who were on the diet for 4 to 5 years. It doesn't mean there was perfect adherence. That would be extremely unlikely. But there's also a question about why we would want perfect adherence, given we want to study like real world conditions of, well, how do people actually do if they go on the Mediterranean diet for 4 or 5 years? What happens? And yeah, they regained the weight.
One of the most compelling parts of your book for me is the message of cruelty that's shown towards fat people in the world, in lots of dimensions, and you've covered so many of those in the discussion. Um, I I listened about 2 years ago to a Science Versus podcast, where they talk about the cause of fatness, and they talk about how it's largely genetic. So they say that it's outside of one's control, and that although there are measures you can take, eating less, exercising, that only accounts for a small part of the variation in people's weight, that actually there's a strong genetic component that's just outside of the control of the person. That discussion has been changed quite a bit by drugs like Ozempic. But prior to Ozempic, that was kind of the consensus view among scientists. Now, that poses some very interesting ramifications towards the cruelty that fat people face. Traditionally, there was a strong movement among the LGBTQ community arguing I was born gay, therefore I should face no stigma in the world. So I was born gay, so there should be no oppression of gay people because this is something outside of my control. Is there an equivalent push in this sphere? So I was born fat, I have these fat genes, these genes that make me more likely to be fat. So it's outside of my control to a large degree, probably maybe to the same degree that it's outside of someone's control what their sexual practices would be or what their sexual desires would be. And so fat people should not face stigma or oppression or systematic oppression.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So one way that I put it in the book is that upwards of 70% of the variation that we find in the human population in terms of body mass is due to genetics. So that means the heritability score for weight or body mass, more accurately, is about 0.7, maybe a little higher. Whereas, just to give a point of comparison, the heritability for height is 0.79. So it's just a little bit higher. Weight is almost as heritable as height. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's the only factor that goes into determining someone's weight. And we have the illusion that it's much more malleable than it actually is because people can manipulate their weight in the short term, just not very well in the long term. Whereas height is, notoriously difficult to have any influence on. But I do think that because of this argument that weight is largely out of an individual's control, that also depends on not just the fact that it is largely the product of genetics at a population level, at least, and probably for most individuals as well. Like there are a lot of genes that go into determining weight, and there are some such that if you have them, you are virtually guaranteed to be in the quote unquote obese category of the BMI charts. But also the other factors that go into determining weight over and above that are things like food environment, access to leisure spaces, the kind of work you have access to, how much time you have to take care of your body, how much you have to face stress, how much you have to face disability, illness, common medications you might need to take that can lead to weight gain, like contraceptive pills, like SSRIs for depression, all sorts of factors that are more or less unchosen, or at least choosing differently is an unfair burden to place on the individual. It gives rise to, I think, an ought implies can argument that is very analogous to what we see in the case of those arguments for being anti-oppressive when it comes to LGBT identities. So this idea is that because weight is something that is not under our long-term, conscious, deliberate control in a minute way, it is not the kind of thing that someone can control in that way. And so it's not the case that someone ought to. And so that is what I think of as a kind of weaker, modified ought implies can principle, where it's something like ought implies can realistically, again, in a humane, reliable, safe, effective, long-term manner. Of course, I'm not denying that someone could become thin, even very thin, via starvation, but that is not a fair thing to ask of any person, nor is it a healthy, sustainable, health-promoting thing to ask of someone. So yeah, some version of an ought implies can principle, which I would like to figure out philosophically what exactly we should say in this vicinity. How to weaken an ought implies can principle in exactly the right way is, I think, an open research question. But some version of an ought implies can principle that is a bit like ought implies can realistically will say that because of this lack of control over our weight, it's not the case that we ought to control our weight. And so it's not the case that we can judge fat bodies or hold negative moral judgments about them, based on this lack of control. However, there's like an addendum here that I think is probably important in the case of both sexuality and weight, which is often people will add these days, I think rightly, even if it was a choice to be gay or to be trans, that's a valid choice. That's great. what's wrong with it? Similarly, in the case of being fat, I think that a more radical and maneuver that I endorse is to say, yeah, like this is something that is also a valid way of being in the world. It's a perfectly good way of having a body. And so even if it is a choice for some people to be a bit fatter because they eat more adventurously or pleasurably or copiously, even, that's a valid choice. People make all sorts of choices in their lives, and I think we should be largely celebrating those choices when they don't harm others.
I agree with that. But an objector could argue something in this sort of way. So they could argue that it can't be as large a genetic component as we think because the incidence of fatness is increasing over time, the frequency. So if you look at American culture specifically, there's this enormous increase in average weight over time. And that if that's genetic, then that's strange. Our genes would have to be changing. And so what is going on there? They argue, well, that if it is a zero point 0.3 out of 1 correlation to other factors that are within the control of the individual, that zero point 0.3 is exercising a lot of control over the current average weight in the US. And so we should be focusing on that. We should be trying to bring that down. That's how the argument goes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's worth saying that there has been an uptick in fatness in this country amongst others, but that has been somewhat exaggerated. And that's partly because of changing classifications for fat bodies, which kicked in when the NIH changed the classification for fatness in 1998. So it lowered the cutoff for being overweight. For example, it used to be that fatness, in terms of being judged overweight on your BMI chart, wouldn't kick in until 27 or 28, depending on gender. Now it starts at 25. Similarly, the standards for obesity were changed. So part of what you see in alleged explosion of fatness is simply like poor journalism that has forgotten that we changed the standards. Now, it's true there's been an uptick in fatness, and no one exactly understands why. It would be very strange to deny that the food environment has something to do with it, that stress and modern lifestyles don't have something to do with it. But many people also believe that dieting has something to do with it, because if you repeatedly go on diets and lose weight and regain weight, you will often end up with overshoot of what some people in this space talk about, people having a set point weight, which is where your body kind of sits comfortably. And that repeated dieting and trying to get below your set point will actually kick in the body's protective mechanisms against the risk of starvation. And so some people will end up above their set points because of that repeated overshoot, due to being under their set point. They'll end up over it because of the body trying to defend against fat loss. So yeah, look, I think we have to be careful here of too much sensationalism and moral panic about the modest uptick in fatness. I think we have to be careful about what mechanisms have actually contributed to increased fatness, which is undeniable, but no scientist that I'm aware of claims we have an exact read of the particular factors and in what proportion have increased fatness in a modest way in Anglo-American and Australian culture. And also we have to be a bit careful of that. So then we need to focus on blah, blah, blah. Well, why are we assuming, again, to get back to that earlier discussion, that being larger is unhealthy? We have to be a bit careful of that, partly because if we've had an increase in people who are in the moderately obese category, they're not suffering from greater mortality risks. So we'd need a further argument that their bodies are a problem to be solved, rather than just a variation that's happened over time that might be aesthetically and socially downranked, but perhaps for unfair reasons that we should be combating by decreasing stigma.
Yeah, there's so much interesting there. I did want to go back to the ought implies can for a minute, and then I want to raise a potential objection. So I think one interesting question is what the relevant sense of can is, and I like the idea of a project that finds something that maybe cashes out the notion of feasibility. And there's a related notion too, and I wonder if you think something like this might be morally relevant as well, and that is what constitutes a relevant option for a person. So some philosophers think that there are things that an agent in the sense of can as applied in the ethics literature that they can do, but they can't be required to do it because it's still not a relevant option for them. So this that's abstract, but Holly Goldman in a paper in the 1970s came up with a case that she called Professor Procrastinate, and then Frank Jackson popularized it, where the professor is invited to write a book review. And she can accept the invitation now, and then she can write the review later. But what she would in fact do if she accepts the invitation, since as you might guess her last name is Procrastinate, is procrastinate and then not get the review done on time, and that'd be the worst outcome. The best outcome would be to accept and to write, because by hypothesis she's the most qualified to do it. And she can do that in the sense that she can accept, and then when the time comes, she can write. And then the second best outcome would be to just decline. And later, Holly Smith gives a refinement of the case where no matter what Professor Procrastinate intends to do at the moment in question where she gets the invitation, she would not end up writing the review when the time comes, even though she could, at that time, write the review. So one way of understanding Holly's view is sometimes called actualism. Say that what she should do when she gets the invitation is she should decline, because what would actually happen if she declines is better than what would actually happen if she accepts. And even though she could, in a sense, both accept the invitation and then write the review, it's not a relevant option for her at any point in time, because there's no point in time at which there's an action available to her such that if she performed the act at that time, it'd result in the best outcome. Sorry, that's a tangent. That's just a debate that I work on and I'm interested in. And so I thought, oh, maybe this, like, one way of cashing this out too might not just be about ought implies can, but about what the relevant options are, even if we grant those a sense in which people can do certain things.
I mean, the reason why I do think those debates are fascinating, the reason why I'm a little hesitant is it gives the impression maybe that fat people are just not going to exercise or just not going to eat right. And the truth of it is, so many of us have actually become so self-disciplined by being told our bodies are inadequate that those are not only relevant options, but options we've actually pursued and stuck to and done the hard work and had will like iron. It just doesn't necessarily change the way our bodies are in the long term. Short term, sure, but yeah, that bodily self-defense against fat loss is, again, not for everyone. There are certainly exceptions to this rule, but the rule is really strong. The rule is well over 90% of people, and more like probably around 98% of people just don't lose weight in the long term, even sticking to those behaviors that are so entrenched as required of people in bigger bodies. It's not surprising, I think, that some people, especially under the pressure of aesthetic fat phobia, some women especially, will develop eating disorders and stick to extremely restrictive diets and even make themselves very ill while remaining in bigger bodies, because their bodies are in a starvation state, but are simply not the kind of body that will become underweight over time. Yeah, so that's why I'm hesitant to go that route. I do think it's interesting. I do think it's important, but for many fat bodies, that's not really how we get and stay fat.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and it segues into the question that I wanted to raise. So Jason had mentioned Ozempic and other weight loss drugs, and you consider a case in your book where, say, right now it's prohibited because it can be really expensive unless insurance covers it, which is rare, and there can be dangerous side effects to it. But it could be that in the relatively near future, those drugs improve and become widely accessible and maybe even costless. And then it's a question, well, in those cases, that might change what people could do safely and while still staying healthy. would that change what their obligations are? And one argument that I've seen some people make, and that you discuss in the book too, is, well, yes, because if they don't, then they will be harming others, not just themselves. They'll be harming others by raising insurance premiums or raising the cost of healthcare in ways that harm other people through no fault of their own.
So knock out the Auden plays can realistically argument whatever exactly that amounts to, however we cash it out more precisely. I think there are still two good arguments against the idea that people are morally obliged to be thin, or at least not to be fat, which there are two arguments that I get into in the book. One is that it's not obvious that even if people do have increased mortality, as in reduced longevity, dying earlier, it's not obvious that they're going to cost the health insurance system more, or the healthcare system more, because they'll probably die younger, and thereby some studies suggest that that will offset sufficiently the costs during their lifetimes, because people don't cost the healthcare system anything post-mortem. So one study, and this is admittedly in the Netherlands, showed that people who are fat on average die 4 years younger than people who are thin, because of that being skewed by people who are very fat largely. And because of that, people who are fat on average cost the system less than their thinner counterparts, because they just require less healthcare, 74 years versus 78 years worth of care. So we have to be really careful in saying fat people are going to cost the healthcare system more, to look at whether this is actually true. So it's similar to what is often known in the literature as the smoker's paradox, where smokers are, unlike fat people, uncontroversially less healthy and likelier to die younger, even with quite, market adjustments for other confounding variables and so on. However, smokers often end up costing the system less because of the rather morbid, dark reason that they die earlier. So that's one factor to just bear in mind. I also want to just put in a bid for, and this is where philosophers, we can be useful in not thinking of the healthcare system as this almost anthropomorphized agent who can be burdened in oh, I'm so burdened way. It's a system that we could improve, and often, especially in the US context, we can make the system much more efficient. And it is also not an agent. It's not something that can be burdened in the sense of being morally burdened. It's just a question of how to make it care adequately for the bodies that we have. So that's just a side note. Third thing, as well as the odd implies can piece of it, as well as the equivalent when it comes to fatness of the smoker's paradox, there's also this third thing which I find really interesting, which is that people in presumptively thin, fit, healthy bodies, non-disabled bodies, take all sorts of risks in their lives, like going skydiving and Grand Prix racing and scuba diving and mountain climbing, things which demonstrably increase your risk of death quite markedly per year that you engage in them, and also increase your likelihood of needing certain social benefits like search and rescue operations, certain kinds of healthcare for burns, or for altitude sickness, whatever. So those healthcare costs are typically not moralized. We typically don't moralize hugely about someone who engages in those activities, as long as they do them reasonably, responsibly, and don't endanger other people. And I think that's really telling with respect to our attitude that, look, someone should be free in general to live the kind of life they want and pursue certain risks, even supposing they do exist, of, for example, not taking Ozempic in the long term. Suppose that does increase your health risk somewhat, but it also means you're more able to enjoy food, and you're not taking a weekly medication that has all these, for most people, unpleasant, but not serious side effects like nausea and diarrhea. And for some people, about 1% of people have more serious side effects like stomach paralysis, gastroparesis. I think an argument by analogy suggests that someone should be free to take one of these weight loss drugs if they choose to, but they shouldn't be considered obligated to even if that did, in fact, make them likely to cost the healthcare system less in the long term, by analogy with someone who takes risks in, say, mountain climbing. Yeah, it's just that we have this sense that the mountain climber is doing something cool and worthwhile, whereas someone who is just choosing to have a somewhat fatter body, I think, to get back to something you mentioned, Jason, I think we are just more likely to have a level of disgust that means that we're likely to moralize their bodies in a way that is actually irrational.
So I wonder if you can talk a bit about that, the disgust reaction. So one objection to fatness might be from an evolutionary argument. So it might be, well, we find fat people less sexually attractive. There must be some good reason for that. And so that's a good reason in and of itself to say that fat people should lose the weight. Now, that's not to say that everything that we're disgusted by is caused by evolutionary reasons, but it may be in this case. And if it is, does that provide a sufficient reason for why it would not be a good idea to be fat?
I think there are all sorts of things we could justify or not justify using a fairly gerrymandered set of evolutionary considerations. I think it actually goes the other way and gives rise to a debunking argument. So the way that I would see this working is more like, look, disgust is a complex moral emotion that was probably something that is very responsive to evolutionary pressures. However, that makes it very irrational and unreliable as an indicator today. For example, the way disgust works in terms of moral psychology is it spreads very quickly. It sticks to certain objects. Once something is tarnished with disgust, it's very hard to shed that disgust towards it. It's subject to one-shot conditioning, which is very unusual. Usually you need a lot of conditioning to build up an association, not so with disgust. If you eat a guava and then independently become nauseous, then you will often have an aversion to guava for the rest of your life. Ask me how I know. Or don't. So disgust also has this interesting property of being ripe for moralization. So if you are disgusted by something or someone, you often will moralize about them because moral disgust and visceral disgust are very hard to distinguish in the body. So this has been shown through various experiments in social psychology where experimenters would artificially induce disgust, for example, by using post-hypnotic suggestion for easily hypnotizable subjects, and thus hypnotize them to feel a visceral sense of disgust upon reading a random vignette featuring entirely neutral behavior and featuring benign behavior like a student council representative who was introducing topics of widespread interest at meetings. Totally fine behavior. But participants who were artificially induced to feel nauseated said that the student council representative was up to something. He was morally beyond the pale. He was suspicious, untrustworthy. One participant said, I don't know why he's doing something wrong. He just is. And the experimenters had actually introduced this vignette as a control. They were surprised by this finding because it was such a powerful effect. Make someone a little bit disgusted by whatever, and they will find reasons why it's morally bad. And I think that's what's going on with fat bodies for complex historical reasons that we've had a chance to just touch on in our conversation. People are often, unfortunately, disgusted by fat bodies, and they thus are likely to moralize about us and say things like, oh, you're placing a burden on society. You're costing the healthcare system. You're glorifying obesity by just like existing in a fat body. And so you get this effect of moralizing what is in fact morally neutral and finding reasons via this post hoc rationalization of what is in fact just a way to be in a body, a way to have a body, a way to be in the world that is valid. That's how I would try to spin, or the way I do try to spin the influence of this evolutionary mechanism of disgust working here. it's sort of the opposite. We shouldn't be relying on these post hoc rationalizations that disgust is likely to induce in us, morally speaking.
So I want to ask one last question, which moves away from the moral objection. And I think you've done a good job showing that, at least in the utilitarian case, that it's not a strong objection, that it fails. Maybe there's an argument to be made, given all the data points that you've raised. So given your observations about the stigma in society against fat people, what a difficult time they have, that their lives are worse off, that they face disgust in the world, someone could accept all of that data and say, okay, that says to me that if it's up to me to decide whether I have a choice, assume for a moment that I do have the choice whether I want to be fat or not. Suppose we live in a world where Travis's Ozempic has no side effects. So there's some super Ozempic that has no side effects. It doesn't affect it doesn't harm me in any way, and I simply have the choice. Given all the data that you've given, doesn't that suggest that my prudential interest should be in not being fat? Don't I have some sort of duty to myself, where we could even frame that as a non-moral duty? It's just that my well-being may be better off. I will be better off in the world, given how badly structured the world is towards fat-bodied people.
I mean, in terms of health, if we're given a choice and we could just like choose our body mass off a menu of items, which is, related to the thought experiment I offer in the book of this being a magic pill, a silver bullet for weight loss, rather than something with costs and side effects and harms, you should choose the overweight category to be in. So that's the healthiest option in terms of just longevity. And especially that's true as people get older, for reasons that relate to the folk wisdom that you described, that I think there is pretty good data to suggest that a certain amount of fat is protective in terms of health. Now, in terms of other factors, like, do you want to be seen as sexy? Do you want to be seen as intellectually viable? Do you want to be seen as morally good? There is, for sure, a prudential reason to choose to be thin. But it's also a bit of a depressing argument in that it assumes, or it would easily carry over to say we should also choose, if we had a menu of options, to be thin, white, non-disabled men who are cis and straight. And that's A, very boring, and B, like, some people like me would actually rather be in the bodies we have, standing up for people who are as or more marginalized. I consider myself a privileged person in every way, bar gender and to some extent body size. I now identify as a small fat person who, for what it's worth, is in the overweight category and isn't someone who suffers from the really market effects of fat phobia. But at any rate, to stand up for people who are as or more marginalized, and to stand in solidarity with all of the people who are in the world with you and who are being bullied and made vulnerable and marginalized on account of these forms of oppression, I think there are both moral but also prudential reasons to do that. I think it's more meaningful. I think it's more interesting. I think it's braver. So that would be what I would choose. But look, people should choose what they want to in the notional world, where we have a menu of options for what our bodies are like on grounds of bodily autonomy. So yeah, I think people are entitled to choose what they like with respect to a notional menu of possible characteristics. But I think it would be certainly not obligatory to choose to be thin on prudential grounds. And I think it might be cooler. So what philosophers rather clumsily call supererogatory, it might be something worth doing on both moral and prudential grounds to actually choose a status that is a little harder and a little more important to instantiate to empower other people. So yeah, that's what I would want for myself, but other people might well feel differently, and that is understandable in the oppressive world that we find ourselves in.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for being on the show. It's a fascinating discussion, and we've been asked before by guests, sometimes after recordings, whether our minds have been changed, the hosts of the show. And I think back to many, many episodes, and very seldom has my mind been changed. But you might have changed my mind today. So thank you very much for being on the show. Thank you, Travis, for being a co-host today. It was wonderful to have you, and you're very welcome back always. And Kate as well, of course, you're very welcome back. And thank you for your time.